Hello. Today we'll be taking a look at the very important topic of logical arguments, especially as used in ethics. Logic has a very specific meaning in this context. In this context, logic refers to the use of reasons to support some further claim, which is going to be something that is going to be very, very important, as you'll continually see as you read through the course materials. For our purposes here, when we talk about reasons in ethics, we talk about reasons why something is morally good or morally bad, or should be morally permissible or impermissible, or a variety of other categories that are important in the study of ethics. And as you'll notice as we progress through these first several units, you'll notice that a reason in ethics has to fulfill certain criteria in order to really count as a good reason, right? As a reason that will be particularly useful. A reason is the thing that actually makes something morally right or wrong, right? And so if logic is the providing of reasons to support some further claim, our reasons are going to support claims about what is morally right or morally wrong in the context of ethics. And it's the reason that's actually going to make the difference, right? The reason is the thing that actually makes something morally right or wrong, and you have to have that if you're going to have any reasonable discussion, well, really about anything, but about ethics in particular. A reason in ethics is going to have to be something, because of what we think ethics is, that's going to apply universally. That is, that would be the same for everybody. If something is, if there's some reason why something is morally right or morally wrong, that reason will be the same no matter who seems to be doing the action, right? So that's what we mean by that a reason in ethics will apply universally. We'll see that a reason in ethics is going to have some obvious connection to human well-being. For example, to pick a particularly ridiculous example, nobody talks about actions being right or wrong insofar as they increase or decrease the total amount of ducks in the world, or the total number of blue things that people own, because those things don't have a really obvious connection to sort of overall human well-being. But people do talk about pain, or about harm, or about rights, or about dignity, right? Those are sorts of things that have a pretty obvious connection to human well-being. And so those are the kinds of things you can expect reasons in ethics to be grounded in. Further, a good reason in ethics is going to require no special prior commitment. And what we generally mean by that is that it doesn't require you to have some particular allegiance or some particular knowledge or something like that before the reason is applicable. One example might be, geographic, right? So you shouldn't necessarily have to be a citizen of a certain country in order for a certain moral claim to matter, or you shouldn't have to believe in a certain body of law or legal theory in order for a moral commitment to matter. One of the most common things in this category is sort of religion. You shouldn't have to necessarily be a member of a certain religion for a particular moral reason to matter. Okay, and so that's a hallmark of good moral reasons as opposed to moral reasons that are not so good. And finally, a reason in ethics isn't going to change. Sometimes the circumstances around that reason can change, or sometimes the context around that will change, but the reason itself should be pretty durable. Otherwise, again, it's not as effective a reason for doing or not doing some particular thing. Of course, we'll talk a lot more about each of these categories as we move through some ideas about some of these reasons, as we examine some of these reasons for things being morally right or morally wrong. And you'll see these apply in various places. So again, I would recommend you, on occasion perhaps, come back to some of these earlier lectures in the course as we continue to progress through, because you'll be able to draw new connections and make some old connections a little bit stronger or clearer. The process of expressing a reason for some further claim is known in academic circles, specifically in philosophy, as making an argument. Okay, so making an argument for our purposes is providing reasons for believing a claim. Okay. In philosophy, and again, generally in academic life, the word argument has a very special usage, right? It's not the same thing as some sort of a squabble, a dispute, or a disagreement, or fisticuffs. Just I put that in there because it's a fun word. So Uh, in common usage, common English, people talk about, oh, they're having an argument. It means that they're actually sort of disagreeing. It's like, yes, it is, no, it isn't, yes, it is, no, it isn't, right? That's not exactly what people in an academic context, specifically a philosophical context, mean when they use the term argument. The term argument is refers to the procedure of providing some reasons to believe some further claim. An argument has specific parts, and those parts have names. This is a very very old and well-trod study. The part of the argument that consist of the reasons, right? The reasons, the claims that are working together in order to support some further claim, they are called collectively the premises. There is no limit to the number of premises an argument may have in theory. An argument might have 10 premises or 50 or 100, but in reality, most of the time, when someone expresses an argument, there will be 2 or 3, sometimes even 4 premises. There should always be more than one, right? A one premise argument is, for reasons that should become clear later, not particularly important. If you get to the end of this lecture and don't quite understand or can't quite think of a reason why a one premise argument wouldn't be very impressive, you should ask that question in the discussion boards, in the discussion area of the course, the content questions area. But if you can, well then great. The conclusion is the other part of the argument. Right, the conclusion is the claim that is being supported by the premises. Arguments have always one and only one conclusion, right? And that conclusion is always one single claim, right? One thing about the world that could either be true or false. Right, so those are the parts of an argument. In order for an argument to be good, because of course not all arguments are equal. Some are good and some are varying degrees of bad, okay? And in order to have a good argument, we have to have some kind of standard. And again, the standards for good arguments are pretty standard. There are 2 criteria for an argument being a good argument. The first of always the first, right, of these criteria is the criterion of validity. Okay, a good argument must be valid. Any invalid argument is not good. Okay, it's entirely binary. There are not arguments that are more valid than others. There's only valid arguments and invalid arguments. Right. And so again, this is a word that has a lot of different uses. A lot of the times people use the word valid to mean more or less similar to good or acceptable in common usage. But in our context, we're using it in a very specific way. So think the general word validity, that's not this. This is a very specific piece of vocabulary with a very specific definition. Right. And the definition of validity for our purposes is the argument is structured in such a way that it is impossible, we mean that in the strictest possible, impossible for the conclusion to be false when the premises are true. One of the biggest troubles that students have getting a grasp on validity early in a course like this one is that they think of the common usage of validity, which generally means something just like good or acceptable or decent sounding or something like that. They get in their heads some idea of validity that isn't exactly this definition. You must use exactly this definition because this is a specific context to use this specific word. Okay, and so the definition is exactly this, that a valid argument is an argument that's structured in such a way that it is impossible for the conclusion to be false when the premises are true. All right, we'll see some examples later, but I want to go to the second criteria just to specify it. The second criteria for a good argument, is the criterion of soundness. Okay. And there's something tricky going on with the definition of soundness. The definition of soundness is that the argument is valid and its premises are true. Okay, so 2 things I want you to notice about this. Number 1, the concept of validity is folded into the concept of soundness. Right, so an argument cannot be sound unless it is first valid, and that's one of the reasons why you always look at validity first. Okay, that's always the first thing you determine. Validity is all about the structure of an argument. You want to know if the argument is structured properly before you worry about the argument's content. All right, that's the second big mistake that many students make when being first introduced to validity and soundness, is that they believe that in order to determine validity, you have to worry about whether the premises or the conclusion are in fact true or not. And you don't. Look very carefully at the definition. All the definition of validity says that you have to determine is whether it's possible for the conclusion to be false while the premises are true. That doesn't say anything about their actual truth or falsity, right? So validity is entirely determined without worrying about whether the premises or conclusion are true, but instead their structure, how they relate to one another. Only when we get to soundness do we start worrying about whether the premises are true, the premises and conclusion are true or not, and really just the premises. Okay. So here are some examples. This here is the basic valid and sound argument that's been used for probably centuries to illustrate this concept to students coming across it for the first time. So you'll notice I've labeled the premises and I've put them above this sort of horizontal line here, and I've labeled the conclusion and put it below this horizontal line here. This is a very common convention in representing arguments formally. It's often called standard form for an argument. And you'll notice Schaefer-Landau, your primary textbook author, will do this a lot. We'll represent arguments by labeling the premises, numbering them, and then labeling the conclusion at the end. And you'll notice each of the premises is one single claim, okay? And the conclusion is one single claim. This is for the sake of clarity. It's always sort of better to do it that way. Because, of course, the kinds of topics we're going to be dealing with in ethics are difficult enough without being imprecise about language, right? So being very precise about language and laying out reasons in a very clear way is one way to help us try and make at least some progress. If we're not so very clear about laying things out and not so very clear about how we use our language, we cannot expect to make very good progress. So look at this argument for a minute and think about the definition of validity that we saw on the previous slide. The definition of validity, and again, you must use the very specific exact definition here, is that it is impossible, right? In a valid argument, it is impossible for the conclusion to be false while the premises are true. So forget everything you know about Socrates or about people or about mortality, right? Just forget all of it for a minute and just look here and say, okay, if it were true that Socrates was a man, and if it were true that all men are mortal, is it possible at all that it's false that Socrates is mortal? And it should seem very clear that the answer is no. It's not possible for Socrates to be mortal while he is a man and while all men are mortal. Okay. Now notice we haven't said that we have to treat anything as true or false here. We're just saying, imagine the premises were true. Is it possible for the conclusion to be false under those circumstances? Right. That's how to approach evaluating an argument for validity. Okay. Once you have then evaluated the argument for validity, you can then move on to thinking about soundness. So premise one, Socrates is a man. Well, that's true, or at least he was one, right? If we want to get really niggly there. Is it true that all men are mortal, right? Well, if it isn't, there can only be one who isn't. So, but in general, yes, it's true that all men are mortal. So, this appears to be then a valid and sound argument. So one more time. Imagine that the premises are true. Is it possible for the conclusion under those circumstances to be false? So this is what you're asked to imagine when evaluating validity. Again, no, that seems to be impossible. It seems to be impossible for the claim in the first premise to be true and the claim in the second premise to be true while the claim in the conclusion is false, right? That combination is an impossible combination. And that is why the argument is valid. Okay, all arguments where you cannot have a false conclusion if the premises are true are valid arguments. And think about why this is the case for a second. The whole point of an argument is to say, here are some reasons that actually support this further claim. If it's possible for those reasons to be true, but for the further claim to be false, well, then those reasons don't really support that further claim after all. So in this case, these two claims, premise 1 and 2, really do support that conclusion in a way that if they were true, the conclusion would have to be. Okay, let's take a look at another example. Here is a valid but unsound argument. Okay. Most of the time, if you just put this argument up on, say, a whiteboard and ask people about it, again, many students being introduced to validity for the first time will look at this argument and will say, oh, it's invalid, right? And the reason they'll say it's invalid is because, of course, premise 2 is false, right? Sometimes there are other reasons why people say that it's invalid, but we won't go there yet. And again, remember that in order to determine validity, you don't actually look at the actual truth or falsity of any of the claims involved. You look at the structure of the argument. So again, let's take a look. Is it possible for the conclusion to be false while those premises are true? So pretend it's true for a second that the author of the Bible is a great writer. Just grant the argument, just grant the claim as true for a moment. Grant the claim that Neil Stephenson wrote the Bible as true for a moment. Of course he didn't, but wouldn't it have been cool if he had? So again, imagine if those two claims were true. Well, then it seems like it would have to be true that Neil Stephenson is a great writer, because if whoever wrote the Bible is a great author and Neil Stephenson wrote the Bible, he would have to be a great writer, right? So those two claims, premise 1 and premise 2, really do lead to the conclusion in the appropriate way. The argument is structured in the appropriate way. It really is impossible for the premises to be true while the conclusion is false. Right? That's an impossible combination. That's what makes the argument valid. But of course, it is unsound, not the least, primarily because Neil Stephenson did not write the Bible. Neil Stephenson, if you've not heard of him, he's a living author. He's alive right now. He's written lots of really great things, but the Bible is not among the things that Neil Stephenson wrote. Okay, and so remember, soundness is an argument that is valid, okay, and has true premises. In this case, the argument is valid, but it's unsound because at least one of its premises is false. Here's an example of an invalid argument. The first premise is that all dogs are mammals. The second premise is that triangles have three sides. And the conclusion is that Millard Fillmore was president. Okay. Now, I want you to notice something about this argument. All three of the claims, both premises and the conclusion, they're all true. Okay, and so the word valid does not mean true. Okay, again, the actual truth or falsity of any of the claims in an argument does not matter at all to validity. Instead, it's the structure of the argument. Notice that premise 1 and premise 2 don't really have, if they were true, they wouldn't necessarily make the conclusion true. Right? They don't have the right kind of relationship with the conclusion for that to be the case. And so we see of this argument, again, imagine that it were true that all dogs were mammals, and imagine it were true that triangles would have three sides. Given those two things, does it have to be true that Millard Fillmore was president? Well, no. Neither of those two things makes it have to be the case that Millard Fillmore was president. I mean, he happened to have been the president, but that's not why, right? And so it's totally possible that in a world where all dogs are mammals and in a world where triangles have three sides, Millard Fillmore doesn't have to be the president, right? It's possible that he wasn't, and so that's a textbook invalid argument. And again, notice I've chosen this one rather carefully. It's one where all the claims are in fact true, but the structure of the argument is wrong. Okay, so this is an invalid argument. One analogy that often gets drawn, and sometimes people find this helpful in terms of talking about the structure of an argument, is by making an analogy to the structure of a house. right? So any good house needs a good plan or sort of blueprint, right? If you want to think of that as a kind of structure. And then the second thing they need is actually to be made of quality materials. And so in this analogy, validity in an argument is like the blueprint of the argument. It's the structure of the argument. It's how the various pieces are related to one another. And soundness is a lot like the content of the argument, right? It's about what is in it, right? What it's made of in some sense. It's not a bad analogy. It does tend to help some people. Now let us turn our attention to taking a look at some examples of arguments specifically as we find them in the field of ethics. And for this, I'm going to lay out an example that is often mentioned in these kinds of cases. This is a real example that it's actually been quite some time now. I remember this quite clearly from when it was going on. Depending on how old you are as a student, you may not remember some of these events. And so just a little bit of background. The two individuals, Laura Campo and Justin Pearson, discovered during an ultrasound that their daughter, who they were to name Theresa, that they were expecting would be born anencephalic. That's a medical term meaning that she would be born without a brain. The parents, decided that the best overall thing to do would be to give up her organs so that other babies in need of them might live. Right? It's fairly rare for infants to need organ transplants, but it's also very rare for babies needing transplants to get those organs. So it's there is some real need there. Anencephalic babies, again, it's a very rare condition, but it does happen. Based on our medical experience, they tend to die very shortly after their birth. And the trouble is that if you wait until they die naturally, it decreases the viability of the organs because of some of the biological processes associated with death, right? The organs start to, there are a lot of risks, right, involved. And so that's one of the reasons why they were, that there's a sort of a problem in this case. There really is a reason to actually, terminate the life of the child, of in this case, baby Theresa, prior to donating the organs. And so this is a really complicated issue, and like many issues in ethics, there are lots of things to be said in lots of different ways. And so on the one hand, Theresa has no brain, okay, and so presumably has no quality of life, no sort of understanding of anything, right? And so it in that sense makes sense to give up her organs, right? There's no nothing we would recognize as a person in the moral sense being harmed here. On the other hand, Theresa is certainly alive, right, by any common medical standard, right? Has a heart and lungs and they're operating. And it does make sense to have laws against killing people for their organs, no matter what medical condition they have, right? So again, these are all reasonable things to hold. And so one might say, in terms of trying to advocate for doing one thing or another, or not doing one thing or another, one would build an argument, right? One would specify for what reason should you do or not do some particular thing. For example, the action that the parents intended to undertake with respect to baby Theresa's organs. So consider this argument here. Okay? In its first premise, it says, if you can prevent something bad without sacrificing something good, you should do it. Right? Premise 2 states that taking Theresa's organs would be preventing the deaths of some babies without taking anything from Theresa, who cannot have experiences. And so therefore Theresa's organs should be taken. Now this format is a very, very common format for arguments in ethics, specifically for arguments about specific issues that you might be facing on a general daily basis. One premise is a general principle, like we have in premise 1. It just says, look, in general, if you can prevent something bad without sacrificing something good, you should. Right? That's a general sort of recognizable as a moral reason there. In premise 2, is a statement about the specific situation we're in that obviously, right, so sort of, goes along with that general principle. And if they, if they work together well enough, well, then they give you this conclusion about what should or shouldn't be done. Okay. So think to yourself whether this argument is valid and then whether it is sound. Okay. While you're thinking about that, let's take a look at another argument. In this argument, the first premise is as follows. Using a person as a mere means is morally wrong. Okay, that's our general principle there. The specific statement says taking Theresa's organs would be using her as a mere means. Right? And so these two claims lead to the conclusion that taking Theresa's organs would be then morally wrong. So again, look at this argument and think of it in terms of validity, evaluate its validity first, then think about its soundness. If you said that both arguments were valid arguments, you were correct, right? They are both structured in such a way that if the premises were true, it would be impossible for those conclusions to be false. The area of disagreement, if you thought that one argument was sound or that both arguments were sound, you've got if you thought both arguments were sound, now you've got sort of a problem to figure out where you might have gone wrong, because they seem to counsel opposite opposing verdicts in this situation. If you thought that neither one was sound, you would have presumably had some reason why you thought at least one premise in each argument was false. But this is actually the complicated part, is trying to determine the soundness here. And that's the main area of disagreement in a case like this one. I noticed that the notes here say the area of disagreement is in the second premise of the arguments. I don't actually think that's right. I think the area of disagreement here is in the first. I think nobody would dispute the second premises of either argument, really. I think it's the first one where the disagreement really is, and so that might be just a small error there in the notes. I apologize for that. It's an example. This is an example of a conflict between principles, right? One principle, the one in the first argument, that says that if you can prevent something bad without sacrificing something good, you should do it, right? That's a principle that looks at the consequences of an action. And on the other hand, we have the first premise of the second argument, the premise that it is wrong to use someone use any person as a means only. Okay. That's a kind of principle that looks at what kind of action it is. And as you'll see, this represents one of the most basic conflicts in all of ethics, right? The conflict between consequences and sort of, for lack of a better word, rights, right? Or sort of, procedures or processes. Means and ends is another way to put it. Do the ends justify the means, or do they not, right? You doubtless will recall very similar examples to the trolley problem rearing their heads here. The trolley case is very much a case that seems to tell you that consequences are what's most important. The doctor case is a case that seems to indicate that it is procedures or rights that are the most important. So this conflict between rights and consequences is pretty significant, and here we are seeing it again. Remember that. Let's take a look at a third argument here, though. So premise one says, if we take the organs of people without brains, then we will decide to take the organs of people with other conditions, say, for example, Down syndrome. Premise two says that it is immoral to take the organs of people with Down syndrome. And so the conclusion is that if we take the organs of people without brains, then we will end up doing something immoral. Now, this is a very common kind of argument, but it's got a very particular kind of a problem. Specifically, arguments like this one are they're slippery slope arguments. And people will sometimes even say this, oh, well, that's just a slippery slope from one thing to another. And it always confuses me a little bit. I always sort of look at people funny when they say that, because if you look in like every sort of study of every critical thinking textbook from every introductory to critical thinking course that's ever been taught, there's a whole section on slippery slope arguments and why they are always faulty. And so when people call their own argument a slippery slope argument, or their own reasoning a slippery slope reasoning, it's like they're saying, no, the argument I believe, it's literally a bad argument. It's a specific kind of bad argument, don't you see? And then expect you to believe the argument. It's very weird. And I think the idea is that most people think that a slippery slope argument is actually a real is okay somehow. No, all slippery slope arguments have a very particular kind of a problem. So let's take a look at another example to illustrate that problem. So let's look at let's call it argument 3A. So the first premise of this argument says, if I eat pizza today, then I will decide to eat spaghetti tomorrow. And premise 2 is, I don't like spaghetti, right? And so the conclusion is, if I eat pizza today, then I'll end up eating something I don't like. Okay, now, if this argument looks sort of like a ridiculous thing, like something that nobody would seriously hold, right, or what nobody would seriously argue, you're right. Now you're seeing the absurdity of the problem. The problem is with a slippery slope argument that it just assumes that whatever next action is somehow automatic, right? And there's nothing you can do about it, right? You decided to comb your hair this morning, but at some point you decided to stop, right? I mean, just because you thought it was a good idea to comb your hair for a few minutes didn't mean that you were committed now to combing your hair every moment for the rest of your life, or something like that. I mean, it's or that if because spaghetti and pizza are both sort of Americanized Italian dishes, they have some degree of similarity. So if you do one thing, you just automatically are locked into having to do some similar thing later. And that's something that all slippery slope arguments just assume. And of course, it's absurd. Doing one thing does not necessarily mean having to do other similar things. In fact, lots of times, depending on how things turn out, something will be either a good precedent or a bad precedent. In fact, arguments about precedent often come in here as well. Someone says, well, look, if we do this thing, it'll set this good precedent or set this bad precedent. Well, I mean, that depends how it turns out, right? If you take a particular kind of action and it turns out really well, then you probably ought to maybe do some similar things if they turn out really well, maybe, right? If they're similar in the right way. If you do something and it turns out very badly, well, maybe don't do something similar in the future. But that's, just doing something never locks you into doing some similar thing later. Right. And so, again, this is the problem with slippery slopes. If that second argument sounds really absurd, notice that argument 3A has exactly the same structure as argument 3. And so if 3A is bad, then argument 3 is also a bad argument. Right. The first premise of both arguments is also faulty. Again, doing one thing does not ever mean that you must or will do some similar thing later, especially not if you don't sort of like it or think it's wrong. Now, looking for arguments in daily life is a big, big challenge. It's actually very hard to do, and it's one of it's a tough thing, right? And very often, one of the reasons that makes it tough is that people don't tend to label their premises and conclusions as such. Philosophers do. A lot of academics do when they're writing formal arguments in their journal articles. A lot of ordinary people expressing their views don't tend to. I think this is partially a defect of an educational system that doesn't insist that people do that when everyone is capable of doing it. But it's a lot of also it's a matter of sort of style or to some extent sometimes a little bit of laziness. I don't know. In general, in ordinary language, words like since or because or thus or therefore often sort of point to something like an argumentative structure where people are using some set of claims to justify some further claim. Again, people supply reasons all the time, but very often they don't format them the way that that would be most clear to understand and be able to analyze. So the ability to identify an argument in somebody's writing really takes a lot of practice and careful thought. It's not the sort of thing where you can say, oh, okay, I remember the definition of validity. Now all of a sudden I know everything about how to analyze people's arguments. That's not the case, right? It's like anything else, it's a skill that requires development and good practice. And so don't expect to be very good at it immediately. Expect to have to put in a lot of sort of repeated effort for a long period of time before you get better at things. That's And that's not just the case with looking at arguments. That's the case with literally everything. Don't expect to be good at things without an awful lot of time, effort, and careful practice. But I will say this, the ability to identify arguments in people's writing is a core ability, not just in philosophy or ethics, but really academic life in general. Anytime you're dealing with something of a difficult problem, anytime you're dealing with something complex, which, the real world is full of difficult and complex things, having some ability to have these kinds of skills are very, very useful. So the last thing I wanted to mention covers some of the other material that Schaefer-Landau does in terms of introducing you to ethics, right? He talks about some different types of theorizing in ethics. He talks about sort of value theory, which is sort of a look into studying what makes a particular form of life good, right, or what the nature of the good is. Metaethics has a lot to do with the meanings of ethical terms, etc. Right? Normative ethics is where we're going to spend an awful lot of our time, where we're going to be taking a look at what kinds of theories of ethics are particularly good or particularly bad, what seems good about them or bad about them, and whether those bad things are so bad that they really can't be used, or whether the good things are so good that they've just got to be the only right view, or something like that. Okay, and so we're going to spend a lot of time in normative ethics. I'm going to add one here that he doesn't exactly mention, at least not in this section of the book, because it's pretty important for what is to come later, and that is descriptive ethics. Descriptive ethics is the project that's done by, say, for example, someone who's working in psychology or ethnography or something like that. So a psychologist might take surveys to try and determine what, in fact, people think about right and wrong. Some ethnographer might study a group of people to say, what do these people think is right or wrong, and how do these people think it's okay to act, etc. Notice the project there is entirely descriptive, right? They're asking what, as a matter of fact, do people do? Right? Or, for example, if they're asking a why question, then they might be asking for an explanation. They would say, how did they come to have such beliefs? Or a psychologist might say, why do people believe that this is right or wrong and that is not right or wrong, or something like that, right? That's all still descriptive. In this course, our approach to ethics is almost entirely normative, right? That is, our concern is what people ought to think is right or wrong and why they ought to think so. Right? So we're not trying to explain why people believe what they believe. We're trying to justify, say, what good reasons does somebody have for believing this, that, or the other thing about morality? And I wanted to sort of wind up with some just general advice about the unit, about the course in general as it continues to unfold. First is that ethics is not merely a common sense thing, right? So don't rely on common sense to take you very far in a course like this one. Now, and the idea is that just because some ethical questions are easy doesn't mean that they all are, right? There is plenty of common sense in ethics, right? Intentionally torturing somebody for no good reason, obviously immoral, okay? Helping somebody across the street if they are having trouble, obviously a perfectly morally praiseworthy thing to do, right? Etc. So like I said, lots of things about ethics are common sense, but that doesn't mean that the study of ethics it has that property. The study of ethics is largely going to focus on the tough issues, right? The issues that it's really hard to know what the right answer is. And while we're on that, there are absolutely wrong answers in ethics, right? An idea that I don't know where people get, but an idea that a lot of people have about fields like this, about fields like, say, philosophy, is to say, well, there's really no right or wrong answer, right? Well, that's not entirely true. Just because there may not be one obviously right answer that everybody automatically agrees to, does not mean that there are not many obviously wrong answers. And one of the things that's very interesting about ethics is that we're a lot more sure about the wrong answers than we are about some obviously right one. As it turns out, there's 3 or 4 large-scale perspectives that seem like they're probably pretty good, but none of them are perfect, and we don't know which one is the best. But we do know that there are a lot of them that are really just, so problematic that they're definitely out, right? They're definitely wrong answers. Okay, and this should be expected. In the end, there's really only one way to get it right, and there are an infinite number of ways to get it wrong. And so we would expect that we would be, we would have a lot more wrong answers than right answers, no matter how long we spend at a task. Some further advice, while we're on the wrong answers, expect to be wrong about something at some point, right? That's not just in this course, but just in life, okay? Think of a time when you've been wrong before, right? Unless you're seriously delusional, you will be able to think of such a time, okay? And most of the time, it's not all bad. I kind of enjoy being wrong about things. I sort of find it thrilling, because what it means is that I then have an opportunity to replace a bad belief with a better one, or even a good belief with an even better one. Right? The whole point about being wrong is that it gives you an opportunity to replace a belief with a better belief. And that I find to be thrilling. And that's, I think, who would want to live a life where you never replace beliefs with better ones, or aren't ever looking for better ones? Okay, so surely there is room for better ideas about morality somewhere. And finally, nothing really important is easy. And morality is among the very most important things. I think in a lot of ways you could say it's the most important thing, right? The most important thing to us is not so much, just imagine like, this is an intellectual exercise that lots of therapists have people do for various reasons. They say, imagine your own funeral and imagine people saying things about them. What do you want them to say? Do you want them to say, oh, they were very rich, or, oh, they were, they made some cool widgets or something, or do you want people to say they were good, right? They were they were morally praiseworthy. Those are the kinds of things that I think we tend to look at and value the very most highly, and so we shouldn't expect something so important to be in any way easy. Based in my experience, ethics is not at all easy, and there's some good reasons why it shouldn't be. So in this lecture, remember some of the most important concepts we have here. The concept of validity, again, very specific definition for that. The concept of soundness. Think about looking around for arguments in your sort of daily life, because you see them all over the place, especially about what people should do or shouldn't do, right? Start really thinking about those reasons. Start giving yourself a lot of practice in identifying these kinds of arguments and evaluating their validity and their soundness.